As per the Galactic Coalition's policy, an ambassador from each member must be present during the first contact with a new intelligent species. Humanity, merely another spot in the Galactic Coalition, was notorious for its volatile culture and biology, casting doubt on the necessity of a human ambassador in first contact missions. Ambassador Julian Rashford endeavored to appear as non-threatening as possible on each mission, but this only made the new species apprehensive about a lurking predator. The most effective strategy was to wait, aboard the ship until the others finished, then introduce humanity from a safe distance while waiting on his holophone for the others to complete their work on this latest mission. Julian played tunes, preparing for the life he'd trained for. Suddenly the airlock opened and 23 ambassadors rushed in. Terrified, "Why weren't we warned? How did we stumble upon this species?" Velak bellowed, "They found us, sent a message for first contact." Nick screamed this was a mistake. "We can't go back," Phala exclaimed in despair. "What happening?" Julian shouted. "We can send a human," Gilfix squawked. Never Borak protested. "Not even a human can stand against this. These beings make humans look like Cretan. No offense." Phala curled up helplessly. Julian was stunned if humans were the Space Orcs. What could this new species be? What do they look like? Mick handed him a visualizer, expecting a Lovecraftian horror. Julian was surprised and smiled. "Oh, I'll go human." My translator detected excitement. "Vlakaped, don't worry, I'll be right back." Julian beamed, waving goodbye. The short walk to the massive tent, set up for first contact, ended with Julian craning his neck to fully take in the sight, still smiling. Oh, this new one didn't immediately run away screaming, which makes our job easier, but he's only slightly larger than them are. We sure this isn't just their species' display of fear? Julian spoke apologies on behalf of my companions. They're quite skittish, but you must admit you're quite an intimidating sight for those of us who are small and lack teeth, claws and spines, like yours, see. He's scared too, just a bit braver. Not at all, Julian corrected. Still smiling, I wouldn't miss this meeting for the world. And yet you lack all the features you just attributed to us. So why aren't you afraid? Is your species devoid of fear? No, we have it, Julian replied. But you strikingly resemble a creature from our fantastical stories, really. And what do you call these beings? Julian laughed, realizing his remarkable position. You closely resemble what we call dragons. The first contact was a success, much to the disbelief of the other 23 ambassadors. It was unanimously decided that humans would act as guides to introduce these new dragons to the GC rules. Even the human representative voted for himself, much to the others' dismay. Do you really just sit here most of the time, while the others do the actual presentations? Asked Friend Ader, the newest ambassador. Yep, Julian replied. Last time was an exception. This is absurd for our protested. The point is to show we're not a threat. How can we do that if we're hiding like predators in ambush? Julian recounted his numerous attempts at alternative approaches. Well, at least I have you for conversation. How did you manage alone, usually playing games on my holophone? He replied with a yawn and stretched the need to double the space on the floor and ceiling to accommodate the ambassador dragon was a welcome change from the previously cramped ship. If I yawned like that, the others would shrink in terror. Smirked. Julian smiled, knowing she was right. I don't understand how you humans aren't afraid like the rest. I prefer having someone for normal conversation. But it's puzzling. We call it pack bonding, Julian replied. If it doesn't immediately try to kill us, we try to befriend it. Sounds like a good way to get killed. Julian shrugged. And yet, here we are. Having domesticated half the planet back on Earth, Fra shook her head in disbelief. I've read about your world and can't decide what's more insane, that you tried or that you succeeded. So many times it worked with you, didn't it? Julian teased. I didn't fall for some alien species tricks, she protested, laughing with Julian. Julian sighed with laughter, wondering when the others would return, as it was taking longer than usual. This time the airlock opened again. A new ship, the same Hustle Boric, entered and addressed them. Good, they're ready to meet you two, remember? No smiling, with teeth finally first. Contact Fra exclaimed, Borax stopped them halfway. Wait here, we'll bring them out, and he left Frost's eye. Guess I wouldn't fit in there anyway. Julian patted her reassuringly. Most facile barely accommodated humans. When we joined, they'll adapt the buildings, indeed resembled human architecture. Judging by the door, heights, and the placement of windows and handles, bipedality seemed more and more likely. The door ahead opened as Vlak returned with the new species. Fra began to smile warmly. No teeth, Julian hissed, in a quick reminder. Fra retracted her teeth, seemingly straining to smile without showing them. Julian worried her appearance might be even more off-putting than usual. He quietly sighed and turned to give his best smile. But the smile died before it could form. A chill spread from Julian's heart. As it raced, his breath became shallow, his skin peed, and he began to sweat. The Huko, these beings, Valek was right. They looked like humans, too much like humans, but their skin was too white and dry, almost translucent. Their faces seemed stretched, their hair too sparse and thread-like, their arms too long, thin and veiny, and their eyes by earth, their eyes black as the void. He'd watched horror movies and wasn't easily scared, but seeing this creature in person, the way it moved, swaying from side to side, its chest not, it moving as if it didn't breathe, his instincts screamed to run for his life. For noticed his hyperventilating. What's wrong? Are you ill? It's terrifying, was all Julian could muster their resemblance to. Humans is uncanny. No, you don't understand. It's horrifying. I can't do this. I need to return to the ship. What? Why no? Is this a human fear response? Is this it? I'm not scary, but that is what about the pack connection? I cannot have a pack connection with that. Well, it's almost here, so pull yourself together. If you could speak to my kind, you can surely speak to this one. Why is it still approaching? Julian wondered in astonishment. They're only supposed to come close enough to see us and keep a safe distance. So why is it still coming closer? Ah, here it is, Vlak announced joyfully, a human practically your kin. Just as described indeed, the creature said in an almost melodious voice. It's delightful to meet another species that shares such a close resemblance. I'm sure our peoples will interact splendidly. Don't count on it, Julian thought grimly, sweat trickling down his forehead. What was he going to do? These beings were about to join the galactic community, and humanity was about to lose its mind in a way entirely different from how they lost it over dragons. He had to do something, say something, but he was paralyzed, Vlak continued. Humans eagerly volunteered to conduct the Euros, Fiati Val. I'm sure they'd be equally willing to do the same for your people. No. Julian burst out to everyone's surprise. Even his own, damn it. Julian, you're a diplomat. Even if these beings are appalling, you must represent humanity with dignity. He closed his eyes if he couldn't see them, even though he still knew they were there. Maybe he could compose himself. I apologize, he finally added. But humans won't be able to interact with your kind. Lack finally noticed Julian's state, and though he had never seen a frightened human before, he recognized fear. And if a human was scared, he prudently took a step back. Julian knew he had to explain his behavior, just hoping they would understand it's not against you. It's a human instinct. It's the one thing all humans fear such a thing exists, Barak exclaimed. Yes, Julian continued. And it's things that look very much like us, but aren't us. We call it the Uncanny Valley. Oh, glory to Zanu, a melodious voice exclaimed. Eliciting a what from all three diplomats, Julian even risked opening one eye to make sure it was the new species speaking. It was, to be honest, it continued. You look unbearably hideous. I've been holding back nausea since I saw you, dreading the thought that we would have to interact regularly. I didn't think I could say anything without causing an incident. Julian was so taken aback that his heart slowed to a reasonable pace. You find me ugly? Yes. Would you take offense if I turned away? No. For heaven's sake, please, Duhuko turned away, covering its eyes. At last, both began to breathe more easily. The absence of visible breathing from it earlier was because it was just as shocked as Julian. It seems we have an understanding, Julian said with a nervous chuckle. Yes, I'll refrain from a handshake. Fearing what your evidently greasy skin might feel like to the touch, no offense, but your fingers are too long for my taste. The grateful exchange of insults in a successful first contact mission would go down in history books. As yet another incredible example of human interaction, the mutually appreciated repulsion referred to as the Uncanny Valley in Little Uglies was cited as the reason by both parties. And while many in the galactic community couldn't understand why two species so similar in appearance would avoid each other, they could accept it. Julian's life undoubtedly would become a bit more complicated from here on out. Maybe one day he'll get used to the appearance of the Hucko ambassador, but until then, the next few first contact missions will certainly be interesting. Was there really a need for a human envoy on first contact missions? This question, once posed by the galactic community, received an affirmative answer with the success of the first contact with dragons. If not for a human, none of the other 23 envoys could have success. F represented the GC to the species dubbed dragons. But the subsequent mission with Hucko, a race remarkably similar to humans, showed that humans could experience fear, and their inability to look at each other created new challenges in demonstrating unity and openness in the Galactic Council GC. If this mission were to fail, then Ambassador Julian Rushford's job might be at risk despite the presence of Hulio on board and the need to wait for 2/3 of each mission. Julian loved his job and considered many of the other ambassadors his friends especially. Fu the Dragon Ambassador and fellow Deathworld comrade. If it meant keeping his job, he'd overcome his instincts and show not a hint of concern towards Hucko. Earth swear he would. This new species became the 27th by now. Dragons and Hucko had well integrated, and Fu had shown a remarkable talent for appearing less threatening once she got some practice, honing her movement technique with a soft grace, her sharpened claws, gentle touches, and her impeccable toothless smile. Julian remained as rigid as ever, explained by his as being bipedal, but at least he had the same smile. The ship landed in the dense forest of this new species world. The trees rivaled Earth's sequoia, but here covered the entire planet. It wasn't a death world, but it was close with fierce storms and more than one predator, but that just meant Julian and Fu would stay behind, not to remind the natives of those predators. The species they were contacting had managed to send the first message to the GC calling themselves Voodoo. It also included images. They looked almost like teddy bears, small with thick black fur. No visible natural weaponry eyes on the sides of their heads like periscopes. All hallmarks of a non-aggressive species that would be terrified and run at the sight of Julian and Fu. The ambassadors exited the ship, and Phala, the ambassador of a semi-rigid aquatic species, led the procession, getting a promotion in seniority when Valak retired. Her nickname's similarity to frail Nadars made most just use Fu's full name, despite its pronunciation difficulty, but Julian insisted he wouldn't mix them up, asked he'd manage that. He proudly said because F is plywood and dragon's fry, the homophone made sense only in human language. And Fu reminded him once more that her species didn't breathe fire as in human mythology. Nonetheless, he preferred Fu. Julian leaned back into his chair, bracing himself for a lengthy wait. His eyes flicked to Fra. You've sharpened your claws. Yes, so what? I thought. Sharp claws were a point of pride for your people, as is a job well done, and a blunt claw is far more conducive to that than a sharp one. Even for your kind, it's a shame you had very fine claws. They suited you. Far's neck bent suspiciously. Julian, you're not flirting, are you? I've heard tales about those you humans call bards. What? No. Julian sprang up. That would be unprofessional. I meant, but his protests were drowned by FR's laughter this time. She had caught him off guard. Your concern for my claws is noted. She nodded in acknowledgement. Time passed. Julian would normally have wilded it away with his holophoner, but he couldn't shake a nag feeling his gaze repeatedly drawn to the dark landscape under the dense canopy. A lingering fear of the dark. No, it wasn't fear. It was something else, something even humans contested. The existence of Fra, have you ever heard of? The sixth sense? The sixth sense of course, the glues have 8 senses. No, not like that, I mean the human. Sixth sense. Do humans have a sixth sense? Julian recognized the tilt of her head indicating curiosity. Well, not exactly, it's more of a superstition. The belief that when something's amiss, just out of sight, we can feel it deep within, and you're feeling that. Now Fra asked cautiously. Julian was silent, staring into the darkness. I don't know, but then he saw it something disrupted, the solid darkness and bark, a slight discoloration right before the ship. Perhaps he'd been subconsciously noticing it all along. But I'm going to find out. He stood and headed for the airlock FR's neck, craning. In surprise, what you're going out alone during first contact, that's against protocol. It could cost you your job. Julian stopped the airlock, opened. She was right, and yet I have to check. I won't go far. He stepped out and activated his holophoner light mode. The dull thud behind him indicated Fra had followed. Are you going to stop me? He asked, slightly stunned. Even with her filed claws, he doubted he'd win that fight. No, I won't let you face a protocol breach alone if I'm there too. They might show leniency, chalk it up to a quirk of death worlds rather than a human trait. She lifted her head, dragon-like, to signify her resolve was unshakable. What happened to valuing a job well done? Julian asked. But he was more than grateful. My people also value loyalty, she emphasized, proving her point. Julian nodded in appreciation. Convenient how humans could mimic many dragon expressions by bending their necks. The two ventured into the forest where Julian noted the color change. He approached cautiously, and as the hunter's light illuminated it, his first reaction was astonishment. It was a ship. He examined it more closely. It bore no resemblance to any known GC ship. Designs. There was a symbol on it and what appeared to be writing, but the translator offered no translation. Whoever owned this ship, they were not from the GC. Think it belongs to the Voodoo. Julian asked, No, I see the cockpit. The seat is too large for the Voodoo depictions. We've seen. Julian surveyed the ship, looking for an entrance. It's overgrown, that feeling. The sixth sense returned. He turned to the darkness and noticed a gleam. He approached slowly. It was another ship as alien as the first, and there another ship, and there another. Abandoned, overgrown vessels hidden under the forest canopy. This isn't the Voodoo's first contact with other species, they lied. It's a trap. We need to reach the others. Wait, Fra exclaimed. Do you feel that? The sixth sense? I don't think I need no eyes as soon as she said it. The forest fell silent, and now that Julian thought about it, he could feel them. The hair on the back of his neck stood up as he swore. He felt predatory. Eyes upon them. It's not the sixth sense, Fra growled. It's the instinct of a death world. What do you think they're waiting for? What all predators wait for? A weakness, a lapse in vigilance, a lone member lagging behind. Maybe we're disturbing them. Maybe they've never seen deathbeers before. Well, if they're going to wait, we won't. Julian decided we'll find the others. He headed in the direction the other envoys had gone. Fro was right behind him, scanning the surroundings with such a fierce look that any of the envoys might have died of a heart attack on the spot. It took longer than Julian would have liked, but they found a log cabin, though it might have been a branch cabin. Considering the size of these trees, Julian was about to break down the small door, but paused. What if he had it all wrong and was about to barge into peaceful diplomacy like some wild beast? No, he had seen the ships. The others were in danger. He broke down the door and nearly fell into a pit on the other side. Julian, free a run. They were just here. They could return at any moment, and they have terrible weapons. It was Nick's voice. Julian looked down to see the floor had been rigged to drop about 15 ft, and the envoys were below. He examined the pit's walls. It was a sheer drop, not slippery, and the massive tree roots didn't allow the dirt and stones to pack tightly. He might be able to climb out, carving his own ladder. He jumped down, trying to roll to lessen the impact. It wasn't perfect. He'd have bruises tomorrow, but what would bruise a human could be life-threatening for some other species. And indeed, there were injuries in the pit. Broken appendages, bent antennas, shattered stems, but all seemed alive. Except, what are you doing? Nick protested now. Now you're trapped here with us. No, I'm not trapped. Where's Fella? He asked the aquatic captain. The most fragile of all evaporation threatened her life. Nick pointed her atmospheric regulator, had been wedged into a corner. Julian hadn't noticed it because one of the other envoys was leaning over it. Her power regulator cracked when we fell. Psych Doll is sharing energy from his respirator. But Julian's eyes narrowed ominously, and Nick instinctively took a step back. "We will get out of here," Julian declared with the certainty of the sun rising. "How maybe you can get out, but we can't." Nick sobbed literally with all 12 of his eyes. Julian approached one of the fallen floor sections and lifted it from the ground. "What's our situation?" he yelled to Fra. "They're still keeping their distance." "I think we've really scared them," Julian strained, propping the floor segment against the pit wall to create a ramp. But it was too steep for those without strong limbs. So he stepped back, lifted his foot, and forcefully stomped on the wood it cracked with. Such a snap that some envoys gasped in shock, possibly thinking Julian had broken his leg, but no. With another blow, his foot went through the wood, creating a foothold. He repeated the process, using the holes as platforms for the next steps, building a ladder with sheer might and adrenaline, while the others stood agop. Most had never seen what a human was capable of. "Now start climbing," Julian shouted when the last hole was made. Faced with the choice of escaping the pit or obeying the fearsome shouting man, they did not hesitate. Julian helped each one up the ladder. When it was the Huko envoy turn, he noted his supernatural appearance and without delay grabbed his long-limbed arm, aiding him up once most were up. Julian went back down, picked up Fila and Piodul in his arms to their horror, and climbed up the ladder with them. Fila's atmospheric regulator weighed about 200 dosli, as Julian knew. So he was well aware that hysterical strength was fueled by adrenaline. "Don't run to the ship. Stay with me and Frey." "All the way," Julian roared. The envoys were now a flock of defenseless sheep with him, and Fra as the shepherd dogs that would keep the wolves at bay. They began heading back to the ship, but moved slowly due to some injuries. "My battery is almost drained," Peel warned. "At this rate, either Fila or I won't make it. Leave me take my battery." "No." Julian roared again. "We leave. No one behind. No one goes without a battery." He lifted them both again, but this time placed them on FR's back. "What are you doing? I'm not a beast of burden," Fra protested in surprise. Julian grunted. Of course, not only the noblest dragons and myths carried others on their back. And that's exactly what you'll need to do to get these two to the ship on time. Are you mad? That's exactly what the Voodoo were waiting for. If I go, they'll take it as a weakness in the herd and attack. Finefar's eyes widened a rare expression of fear. "You really have lost your mind." "No." Julian disagreed. "I'm furious." Fra tried to respond, but found no words, looking him up and down and seeing Julian's fists clenched tight, as solid as clubs. She nutted all right, and she ran towards the ship, shouting back at him, "I'm still not one of your mythical human dragons." When Julian was left alone, eyes that had been watching them began descending from the trees. They had no vestibular mouths, possibly buried under all that fur, but the Voodoo made a chirping sound unlike any teddy bear as they descended, holding shinny metal spears as tall as themselves. Practically sticks to Julian, but whatever those spears were made of, this was no medieval affair. The edges sparkled with circuits, and the tips were screwed in with bubbles of liquid wherever they came from. "Just stick together and keep moving towards the ship. Don't let them turn you around," Julian ordered, and then they attacked with a piercing screech. They pounced on the group. The first lay face down lifeless before an envoy could even scream. A single punch from Julian to the head was all it took, undoubtedly. It didn't expect Julian to move so fast or reach so far. The other Voodoo hesitated at that moment. Even another human would have doubted. Adrenaline is a powerful drug, and Julian was practically foaming with it, small spear carrying monsters surrounding him. His instincts were fully tensed years of suppressed emotions from intense training and exercises in controlling human anger so that no one would ever be hurt in a fit of rage. Dozens of restrained fights over years of dealing with fragile aliens all surfaced, and he had no mercy for these deceitful predators who poached his friends. He even charged at the next one, catching them completely off guard. His foot hit it like a football, sending it crunching into the nearest tall tree. It didn't get up. He actually roared like a real orc. The Voodoo finally came to their center and attacked in unison this time. Julian swung his arms and legs mercilessly. They had to cover twice the distance he did to strike with their spears. That meant he managed to hit 1, 2, 3, 4 more, and they still hadn't had a chance for one good strike. He used his legs to dodge attacks as often as to hit in the stomach and send flying already dead through the air. One jumped onto his torso and he actually caught it, and with the same swift motion, flung this little gremlin right into another, who again separated to attack one of the envoys. Another managed to get close enough behind him and jabbed a spear into his leg. Julian screamed as electricity and stinging venom hit his nerves simultaneously. And the gremlins cheered, but then Julian turned and kicked the one who had struck him, causing an audible gasp among the gathered creatures. It was clear they thought one hit would be enough in reality. It might as well have been a taser and a beasting. Their weapon wasn't designed for the deadly. The next punch that landed dispelled their stupor, and they finally realized what these little monsters were up against: a real monster. They screamed in panic and scattered. "And never try that again," he yelled after them, panting heavily. When Julian returned to the envoys, they looked utterly stunned. Nick spoke up. "You just killed 23 of them with your bare hands, if Psyop counted." Julian thought it must be accurate. He hadn't kept count himself. Nick continued as Julian remained silent. "I knew humans were supposed to be strong and volatile, but that was a massacre. You all made it out alive." Julian smiled with relief. He knew nightmares of tiny spear-wielding monsters would haunt him as much as they would the diplomats about himself. Returning to the ship, Fiala and Psycho Doll awaited them. For approached Julian, "We heard a roar like that of a ferocious beast from my home planet. That was, he wasn't at 23, of them taken down with his bare hands and feet." Nick exclaimed, answering for him. 23, she echoed. "I'm sure I could have matched that, if my claws weren't so dull. But to protect the others while doing so, how did you manage? Let's just say humans are quick and we have our own stimulants." "Adrenaline," Julian parried. "I almost wish I had seen it in action." Fra murmured, "Inhabitants of deadly worlds." Nick muttered under his breath, as if cursing. Speaking of adrenaline, Julian was running out. He staggered, suddenly feeling a searing pain in his lower leg. "You're injured," Fra exclaimed, catching Julian before he could fall. "It's fine. It was practically a pencil stab, huh?" He tried to put weight on the injured leg, but the poison, though not lethal, hurt. Now that the adrenaline had faded, "Come on." Youre said she hoisted him onto her back and headed for the airlock. "I thought you said you weren't one of those mythical human dragons, and I thought you said you weren't flirting most noble of dragons." "All right, fine. Maybe I flirted a bit. Humans do crazy things when adrenaline kicks in. It didn't start just now, and you know it. Besides, I wouldn't mind seeing your crazy side. More often barred." Julian blinked, realizing what Fra had just implied when the report of the first contact's first and only failed. Mission came and the Galactic Council was stunned. Their first question was whether a human was to blame. The immediate and emphatic answer was no. "Never remove humans from first contact missions, we implore you. They are absolutely essential."